I don't claim to have all the answers. I know I'm going to make mistakes.
How many talks do you reckon I've done this year?
Maybe about 50.
I swear there'd be more than that.
Usually recipients of Australian of the Year are much older than I am. They have more experience and they've got some knowledge of how to navigate, you know, a speaking circuit.
The answer is probably not a sustainable amount. I can't be operating at this pace for the rest of my life.
If we can get through this year, we can get through anything.
Max and I were flying by the seat of our pants. We still are.
People flock to her, people are drawn to her because of the way that she speaks, the way that she conveys her message. She's so fiercely strong whilst being incredibly vulnerable all at the same time. And I think that's why so many people can connect with her.
So the ABC is filming this morning. If you don't want to be filmed, put your hand up.
She's very polished and she's very articulate and she's very intelligent, but she's still just a 26-year-old who's doing all the things that 26-year-olds do and who's processing years of trauma.
I lost my virginity to a pedophile. I was 15. I spent the next 6 months being raped by him nearly every day at school on the floor of his office.
Grace Tame is a very outspoken Australian of the Year, and she's disturbed some people because of her direct criticisms. But she has started and kept going a national conversation that we probably needed to have.
Child sexual abuse and cultures that enable it still exist.
Our collective voices can make a difference.
My job is to hear and stand with the oppressed. And if I have a platform that allows me to do that, you bet your ass I'm gonna use it.
Let's make some noise, Australia!
So did you two bring your babies?
No. Yeah. And
it means a lot having Grace home now.
It's a lovely idea.
We're a close-knit family and it's wonderful to spend time together, especially after the relationship between Grace and her little brother Oscar was so disrupted when the abuse happened and Grace moved overseas.
Okay, I'll put the kettle on.
Oh, thank you.
Grace was living in the United States when she was diagnosed with high-functioning autism. And that then helped us to understand some of the things that we had just accepted and maybe occasionally struggled along with, but didn't understand.
The autism diagnosis was certainly a vital piece of the puzzle, which helped bring a little bit more clarity to the picture. But it's also very confronting. You know, I already felt like there was something wrong with me.
Grace doesn't necessarily read social cues, but I think it's what contributes to Grace's fierce honesty. She can only tell the truth as she sees it, and she can be very blunt with the truth. It might upset some people, but I think perhaps truth is what we need to hear.
My childhood was, for the most part, it was full of love, it was full of laughter and adventure.
Tell us a story, Grace Tame.
One fine day in the middle of the night, two dead men got up to fight.
I threw myself at life with every fibre of my tiny but mighty being.
So just ignore that one.
You know, there was nothing I didn't have a good crack at.
One fine day in the middle of the night, the sea caught up.
I was the only girl on my primary school soccer team from grade 3 to 6. I was also a very keen, albeit shithouse ballroom dancer. I loved school, I loved to learn. I had a mind like a sponge.
Grace's father and I split when she was about 2 years old. We've always remained on good terms.
When we were growing up, it just became the norm for her to live half the time at her dad's and half at her mum's.
Although they separated amicably, there was a natural instability that resulted from that. Until I was 15, I had not lived in the same place for more than a week at a time. I mostly lived out of a school bag.
We know now that she was particularly vulnerable to being sexually abused.
When I was 6 years old, I was abused by an older child who asked me to get undressed in a closet before molesting me. And that was an experience that, as a 6-year-old, I didn't have the context to understand.
Grace was targeted for bullying in high school. It was an all-girls school. I think she struggled socially, not picking up on these social cues. And that contributed to her developing anorexia.
Anorexia has plagued me most of my life, since I was 12.
Grace was 14 years old when she was first hospitalised with anorexia nervosa, and she relapsed a year later.
In April 2010, because I was relapsing, my parents took me to the doctor again. So I went to the doctor's appointment and then I came back to campus only to discover that the rest of my Year 10 classmates were on this excursion that I'd completely forgotten about. And so I was walking around aimlessly in the courtyard. And that's when this teacher, this senior teacher, spotted me. He asked me to go into his office to have a chat. I thought nothing odd of it. I sat in his office and he asked me questions about the illness. He wasn't arguing with me. He was telling me everything that I wanted to hear. And I didn't have that. And that subtle process of gradually undermining my genuine support network started from that moment.
When I picked her up that afternoon, Grace told me she had spent a lot of the day in the office of a teacher. I found that disturbing. By the end of the week, he had given her a key to his office and he was getting her to stay in his office for long periods of time. So I had requested a meeting with the principal at the school. The principal then met with the offender and with Grace to tell them that they were not to have any more contact.
So that must have been early May. But then in June, the grooming picked up again. In the grooming phase, before this pedophile actually introduced the sexual abuse, I disclosed to him my experience of being molested as a 6-year-old. Now, months later, when the pedophile actually did introduce the sexual abuse of me, he did so by recreating my childhood trauma. He led me to a well-hidden storeroom, and without hesitating, he asked me to go into the closet and take off my clothes.
We didn't know when the abuse started. We just knew that Grace's behaviour was becoming more and more erratic. She started self-harming. She started disappearing from the house at night sometimes.
I had this crippling fear of abandonment. So I became fixated on the attention that he gave me. Now, when this attention elevated to sexual abuse, I still had the compulsion to be in his presence. If he would pull back, then I would think that to get his attention, I needed to do something, sexual, because that's what he liked. Confusion doesn't even cut it. It's the closest thing that I can imagine would be like being possessed. It is, in a way, a form of possession that is designed by the perpetrator. April 2011, that's the turning point. My crippling fear of this man was replaced by a different fear. He told me about another girl, and I was terrified by the thought of there being others. I told the school principal what had happened, and shortly after that conversation, the police were called to the school.
I was devastated when I found out. Even when we discussed with the principal all of our concerns, we didn't think that there was a threat of sexual abuse of Grace. It wasn't on our radar, and we trusted the school.
A Hobart court has heard a teacher at St Michael's Collegiate and a teenage student had sex at the school during a 6-month affair. 59-year-old Nicholas Ockett-Bester was a senior science teacher at the private girls' school when
he was charged with maintaining a sexual relationship with a person under the age of 17. The word relationship has connotations of consent, and naturally the media's interpretation of it was that it was an affair, some kind of sordid affair. I thought everyone thought that it was my fault. The shame and the blame was all mine.
Grace wasn't allowed to tell her story, tell her side of everything. They only heard his.
Bester told police he felt pity for the girl who was suffering from an eating disorder, and this had clouded his judgment.
The teacher was sentenced to 2 years and 10 months. That did include a period for the possession of child exploitation material as well as the sexual abuse of Grace.
Grace eventually did go back to school, which was incredibly difficult.
Girls that she went to school with would say awful things about her. She was asking for it, that she was, that she was a slut.
She eventually did move schools, which I think helped, but it was going to be with her everywhere she went.
Grace needed a lot of help. She was dabbling in drugs. She needed to get out of Hobart.
6 months after graduating, I flew to the United States. I had one friend in a place called Santa Barbara, which is 90 minutes north of Los Angeles. And I enrolled at a community college there and studied for a couple of years.
She was able to explore and grow as a person because of that anonymity that she had over there. So that was really positive. But the thing about trauma is that it comes out in so many other ways that are toxic, partying, drinking, being involved in that sort of Hollywood lifestyle.
I didn't have any boundaries because mine had been completely eroded. And what I had been groomed to tolerate was also what I had been groomed to expect. Abuse was familiar to me. And in the US, I found myself in more abusive relationships. After the pedophile was released from prison on good behaviour, he was awarded a federally funded PhD scholarship to the only university here in Tasmania, while my mother was also studying there.
My concerns about the offender's behaviour at uni, on campus, led to some other students running a petition. That's how Nina Fennell came into contact with this case.
The first time I met Grace, it was actually over Skype, and she was in LA. I was doing a lot of reporting on sexual assault within university spaces.
It's really surreal. It's so surreal. I can't believe that.
Once Grace and Nina developed their relationship,
It's like 3D Grace.
I think that they realised the value in Grace's story and Grace speaking out.
I'm excited about the potential to positively impact their lives.
But the block in the way was Grace not being able to speak out under her own name.
Because of this bizarre law in Tasmania, I couldn't name Grace, and if I did name Grace, not only could I be prosecuted as the journalist, but horrendously, she could be prosecuted as well. That's when I came up with the idea for a campaign, and I called it Let Her Speak. The campaign grew and grew, and we ended up taking 17 individual cases to court. And last year we managed to overturn the law itself.
April 2019, I was granted a special exemption to share my story. It meant that I had my voice back after all this time of watching other people, including the perpetrator of the abuse against me, talk about my experience and change the narrative.
My marriage, I lost my children, I lost my job.
I had my power back.
Grace was still over in America while all this was playing out. And when we won Grace that exemption, she just wanted to be on the next flight out to Australia in order to tell her story on home soil.
It meant that I could fully lend myself and my story to the greater cause.
Exhale, press the mat away. Inhale, arms forward.
Coming home can also be a really hard thing for a sexual abuse survivor, particularly in a small place like Hobart where everybody knows who you are.
Inhale, reach up, and then exhale, bend.
Grace was re-establishing herself, working part-time as a yoga instructor.
She was just sort of settling back home, and all of a sudden this guy came on the scene, and she was like, oh, I've met this guy, and he's a runner as well.
Well, yeah, I've had a very long day, so my brain cells are really not at the moment.
We started talking and we decided to go on a date.
That is smug. It's more of a smug dishwasher than a smeg dishwasher.
It's hard to sort of explain. We're both pretty unique. We've got cheeky senses of humour.
It is.
Grace is very much herself with Max.
It's on a mug as well.
And Max can totally keep up with her and gets her humour.
And we've just pulled it all out.
He's got the biggest heart. I never in my life thought I would ever find this after everything that I went through.
What have we got tomorrow, Dom?
Gym tomorrow morning.
1 week to the day after I met Max was the Tasmanian Australian of the Year Awards ceremony.
Back into running, finally.
Grace mentioned in passing that she was nominated for the Tasmanian of the Year Awards, but she didn't put too much emphasis on it, and that was it.
I was nominated alongside some incredible people, and I just thought, oh, well, there's absolutely no chance that I'll be winning.
Grace Tame.
Amazing Grace, a sexual abuse survivor named Tasmanian of the Year.
I'm speechless, ironically. Let her speak, and now I can't say anything.
When Grace won Tasmanian of the Year, we knew that she was then in the running to win Australian of the Year.
We went over to Canberra, I think it was approximately 6 days beforehand. After being there for a couple of days, we were like, this is bigger than Ben-Hur, this is quite a big deal. And we probably should stop walking around with no shoes on and start taking things a little bit more seriously.
2021 Australian of the Year is Grace Tame.
We had no idea how Grace was going to go. It blew us all away.
I remember him saying, "Don't make a sound." Well, hear me now. Using my voice amongst a growing chorus of voices that will not be silenced. Let's make some noise, Australia!
Right from the outset, she was in our faces. Her whole message was, let's make some noise, and she has lived that message from the moment she accepted that award from the Prime Minister. She has not been afraid to say what she thinks.
Looking back at the Australian of the Year awards ceremony, really it foreshadowed a huge shift.
There were a sequence of events that occurred after Grace Tame's appointment, and I think they're not disconnected.
Federal Parliament has been rocked by claims that a female staff member was raped by a colleague inside a minister's office.
Brittany Higgins was inspired by Australian of the Year Grace Tame to go public with her story.
It then became this national conversation about this issue of how we deal with women, attitudes to women, attitudes to sexual assault.
Thousands of Australians have turned out at rallies across the country calling for an end to sexism and violence against women.
We are here because it's unfathomable that we are still having to fight this same stale, tired fight.
I think the conversation became uncomfortable for the government. And you could tell from the way the Prime Minister responded that it was tough for him. It was difficult for him to work out how to respond.
Jenny and I spoke last night. She said to me, you have to think about this as a father.
It shouldn't take having children to have a conscience. And actually, on top of that, having children doesn't guarantee a conscience.
We should absolutely condemn sexual abuse, but it hasn't been. People like Brittany Higgins have been treated like the scum of the earth. That sends a very clear message.
How can this government seriously claim to care about women's safety and children's safety when it won't even be accountable for and swiftly and directly address the issue of sexism within its own ranks?
Grace isn't speaking against the government just because she has something against the government. Grace is speaking out about injustices that she has witnessed this year in her tenure as Australian of the Year.
She's not afraid to call a spade, and I don't think it's necessarily that she's partisan. I think it's that she's honest. And I think the fact that Grace is so direct and she's articulate and she's authentic threatens people.
Australian of the Year, Grace Tame, has become quite a toxic influencer, I think.
You have to accept if you are going to dish it, you must be prepared to cop it as well. That's part and parcel.
Grace Tame, who's become a one-person political campaign wrecking and censorship machine in Australian
I do
politics.
think we need to understand that it was her pushing back against keeping quiet that saw her awarded this honour in the first place. So I think people who are asking her to be quiet and to guard what she says need to remember that actually is part of what we are honouring. We might not like what she says all the time, but she is there as an advocate.
If I did not stand up and speak truth to power, which is what I have always done, I would be a hypocrite.
My experience is a very strange intersection. So not only was I given this platform and sort of thrust into the limelight, But I'm also a survivor of child sexual abuse who's...
I don't think the Australia Day Council were prepared for what they were really bestowing on Grace.
You know, often I'm on national television and I'll be asked a question that frames my experience in a context that I've never thought of it in before.
They may say it's just an award, it's not a job, but they know full well that with this award comes a huge level of media scrutiny, as well as a level of responsibility to represent a particular cause.
If you are triggered, you are at the mercy of your trauma. And
what quickly ensued was just this storm of speeches and interviews and her telling her story over and over and over again.
I lost my virginity to a 58-year-old pedophile and spent the next 6 months being raped by him at school nearly every day on the floor of his office. At school. After school. In my uniform. On the floor.
It is a traumatic story to have to retell all the time. And I don't think she was prepared for that at all.
Grace is very open about the toll that this is taking on her mental health. I wouldn't wish her year on my worst enemy, let alone someone who's got a sexual assault history.
Yeah, I mean, I've been diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, you need emotional support.
Max quit his job and he's now working full-time with Grace. Everything that Grace does, Max is there behind the scenes helping her out.
I wonder whether the processes and support network around the recipient haven't quite moved with the times in terms of media demands, social media, and the expectations that come with that and the pressure.
It's not surprising that so many people are trying to reach out to you and connect with you. And
None of us anticipated how many people would come forward with their own stories of child sexual abuse.
It's really hard for me because I'm the type of person who wants to help every single person.
We actually employ a trauma-informed psychologist who specialises in sexual assault counselling to deal with all of the disclosures that I have received and continue to receive. It's in the thousands.
It's about taking everybody's story seriously.
As far as this year's gone, like, we've given our all. We haven't left too many stones unturned.
Where'd you get the raspberries from?
I think she's been an exceptional Australian of the Year because she's brought to our attention an issue that we are uncomfortable about, that we don't like to face and discuss.
Trench coats tend to be a symbol of the opposition of our cause anyway.
Yes, that's right.
And I think Grace has done amazing things for breaking down the stigma.
To turn up in a trench coat.
And putting the blame right where it needs to sit, which is at the feet of the perpetrators. And I think she's freed a lot of people of the guilt and the shame that they've lived with.
There's a lot more swell than usual. It's a bit suspicious.
Child sexual abuse is permanently damaging, but it doesn't have to stop you from doing anything. You know, and it can be the very thing, in fact, that helps you, that drives you to achieve great things.
The school where the abuse happened has been reaching out to us for a couple of years.
When I started at St Michael's Collegiate School, I wanted to make sure that she knew that I was incredibly sorry for what had happened here at Collegiate, and I wanted her to know that we were ready and willing to support her in any way we could. Let's give Grace a very warm welcome.
The new principal actually invited me to go and speak to the senior students and some of the staff as well, many of whom were there during my time.
We all know why I'm uneasy, and it has nothing to do with anybody in this room. He's been in here though, in this very hall,
She got to speak to the girls and say her truth about what happened. She was very candid.
I am one of at least 5 girls who were targeted, conditioned and exploited here, some of whose experiences of abuse were already known to the school before I was even born.
It's completely unacceptable that this abuse was allowed to happen. We can't move on, I don't think, until we know the full extent of the history. So I really would like any former students who understandably have found it difficult to come forward to know that they can come forward.
I've made peace with the school because as someone who has been groomed, I know how deeply confusing and stupefying it is.
All I knew is
a lot of people in the system were used by this man.
I came back actually after
It was quite overwhelming. She was looking out at a sea of students in the same uniform that she used to wear and seeing staff members that she used to know as her teachers. She just demonstrated extraordinary bravery.
And for all that I lost here, I have gained it all and more in return simply by being able to share in this moment with you. I never got to graduate from this school, but this has been an honour. Thank you for having me.